China's President Xi Jinping has sought support from Vietnam against American tariffs as he embarks on a tour of Southeast Asia. He's warned there are no winners in a trade war. The director of the Lowy Institute's Southeast Asia program, Susanna Patton, says there's a long and complex history between the two Asian nations.
I think this tour would have been planned well before Donald Trump's tariff announcements. But I think the timing really does suggest that China thinks now is a good opportunity to advance its interests in each of the three countries. And they are quite different. In the case of Cambodia and Malaysia, he hasn't visited in a long time, 9 and 12 years respectively. But in the case of Vietnam, he goes there. He's been there more recently. He was there at the end of 2023. And I think Vietnam in particular is seen by China as a really critical neighbour that it can't afford to lose.
Yeah, could you give us a bit more of an idea of the relationship between China and Vietnam? We know that on this trip, the two countries have signed dozens of cooperation agreements.
It's a very long and complex historical relationship between China and Vietnam. Vietnam has to really carefully calibrate deference to its giant neighbour in the north, as well as defiance, so opposing China particularly in the South China Sea. But because both countries are communist countries, they do have close party-to-party relationships, and increasingly they also have a lot of economic integration. So a large amount of Chinese private investment has come into Vietnam since the first US-China trade war under the first Trump administration, because companies were looking to relocate some of their supply chains out of China and avoid punitive US tariffs. Now, of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about the trajectory of that dynamic because we don't yet know where the final landing point will be for US tariffs on either China or Vietnam.
And do we know much yet about the deals or these so-called cooperation agreements which have been signed this week between China and Vietnam?
So there's a series of agreements. The most significant is probably an agreement to cooperate on a railway which will link southern China with northern Vietnam, and that's something that Vietnam has historically been very cautious about. So that could be a further driver of industrial integration between the two economies. But I think more important than any of the individual deals which are being signed is the question around the political messaging of the visit. From China's perspective, it will very much be seeking to garner Vietnam's support for its narrative, which is really opposing US tariffs, what it calls unilateralism and protectionism of the United States. But Vietnam, meanwhile, I think is going to be pretty cautious about that because it has its own interests in continuing to pursue a bilateral tariff reduction agreement with the Trump administration.
And do we have much of an idea of what's expected when Xi Jinping visits Cambodia and Malaysia?
I think there'll be a little bit more of the same. So China positioning itself as a steadfast and reliable partner, in contrast to the United States, even though it might not name the United States explicitly. I think that contrast is going to be very apparent. I think another series of big agreements or numerous agreements is likely, but in some ways, the economic trends are against really substantive announcements for a couple of reasons. One is that China's development finance to Southeast Asia has been trending down for some time. So big new infrastructure spending announcements seem unlikely. And another reason why agreements are less likely to be really substantive is because ultimately, in many ways, Southeast Asian economies are competing with China. And China's industrial exports actually threaten Southeast Asia's ability to sustain its own manufacturing. And there's a risk that Southeast Asian economies could also be swamped with cheap imports from China, especially as China now faces those import barriers in both the US and Europe. So I think the underlying dynamics are likely to make really substantive new agreements unlikely.
And how might this all be received outside of Southeast Asia? How do you expect the United States might see this relationship between China and Vietnam and China, I guess, reaching out and visiting all of these nations?
Well, in some ways, I think this is nothing new. Of course, China is a neighbouring country, and it's been a clear trend for a long time now that China has paid much more high-level attention to Southeast Asia than the United States. So it's a bit unclear the extent to which the Trump administration really cares or gives much thought to Southeast Asia. But I think where this could bite is that Southeast Asian countries have been accused of being a backdoor for Chinese exports to the United States. So they will be really wary about the perception that they're colluding with China in that way, because it could damage their own efforts to reach bilateral deals with the Trump administration. So I think there'll be a degree of wariness from Southeast Asia to avoid some of those criticisms down the track.
Okay, Susanna Patton, the Director of the Lowy Institute's Southeast Asia program. Thank you so much for your time.